Hello and welcome back. Our game class is complete. So let's now go work on our player class so we can do all the fun stuff within a game, like move our little rectangle throughout the game window. So our player class only has two methods here, our initialization method and our update method. We'll start with the initialization method. If you look, when we initialize a player, we are passing in an X coordinate, a Y coordinate, a size, and a color. So why don't we set all of these as attributes of the player class? So we'll say set the player values from past arguments. Okay, so we'll say self.x is equal to x, self.y is equal to y, self.size is equal to size, and self.color is equal to color. Wonderful. I will also initialize some attributes that are going to help us with moving the player whenever I press a key. So we'll say, down here I'll then say initialize other player values. So we're going to call, one called dx, so self.dx, and I'll set it equal to 0. And then we'll have one called self.dy, and I'll set it equal to 0. And these are going to help us determine what direction our player is trying to move in. So if dx is 0, it means the player is not trying to move horizontally, and if dy is 0, the player is not trying to move vertically. But if we say change this to, I don't know, say -1, well, then that means in dx, it means the player is trying to move to the left. If I set it to +1, it would mean the player is trying to move to the right. And so we'll use that coming up momentarily when we're trying to move our player. Let's also set a coordinate attribute, self.coord I'll call it, which is the actual coordinate of the player. Now, the coordinates are of the form starting x, starting y, ending x, and ending y. So the starting x coordinate for our rectangle, because we're using a rectangle, would be self.x. Our starting y will be self.y, and then what do we want our ending x and ending y to be? Well, I want it to be whatever the size of the rectangle is that I specify. So I'll say self.size and self.size. All right, perfect. So now that that's done, now that we actually have some values here for our player object, why don't we go down to the game's draw method? And if we look, remember we were drawing a rectangle and we were just hard coding some of these things in here. Let's actually write them in reference to the player object that is currently attached to our game object. So if you remember, our game object has an attribute self.player. It is the player that we passed in right here. So we'll use that information on our draw method. So let's get rid of the color, and we'll access our color through self.player.color. And we'll access our coordinates through self.player, so that's the game's player object, and that player object has a coordinate attribute. All right, perfect. So that's a lot better now. So let's come back up here. And now what we have to do is we have to write our player's update method. Now, the update method, this is going to get called every iteration of the main game loop, because in every iteration of the main game loop, we are calling the game's update method, and in the game update method, we'll call the player's update method. Now, inside of here, we essentially want to move the player. So I'm going to press some keys and I want the player to move. So what we'll do is we'll check to see if there are any keys that are pressed. Now, checking to see if a key is pressed is not a game event in Python. Now, doing something when a key is pressed, so the pressing of a key or the releasing of a key, that is an event. But just holding a key down is not an event. And so if we were to look for something to happen when we press a key or when we release a key, those events would get emptied out of the event queue right here. And so we wouldn't be able to process those in our update method for our player class. Thankfully, we don't need an event here. We're just going to check to see, hey, are any keys being held down? And if they are, what keys are being held down? Oh, is the up key being held down? I guess the player wants to move up. And so we'll see how to do that right here in the player's update method. So the first thing that we're going to do is we'll get a list of all of the keys that are currently being pressed down. So we'll say check to see if a key is being held down. So we'll get a list, we'll call it keys, and the way we get the list of all of the keys that are being pressed down, we'll call pygame.key.get_pressed. So this will return a list of all keys that are being pressed down, and each of those keys has a different name, and we'll talk about those momentarily. Now, before we begin setting up to move the player, let's create a rect to chart the player's movement. Similar to how we had we had a text object, and then we created a rect object, and we moved the rect object. We're going to create a rect to sort of control or position our player exactly where we want it to be. So we'll say create a rect to chart player movement. And so we'll call this player rect, and it is going to be pygame.draw.rect. And here, what surface do we want to draw a rectangle to? We'll say display surface. What color do we want it to be? We'll use self.color, the player's color. And what is the coordinate to draw this rectangle? Well, we'll use the player's coordinate, self.coord. Now, this creates a rect, but we're not actually drawing it to the surface here. We're not going to draw it at all. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to use it to keep track of its current coordinates, its current position. So now we will actually move the player. So we're going to see if the user is pressing a specific key, then we're going to move them, but we're also going to put some boundary conditions on the player, meaning the player is not going to be able to move up past the top of the screen, past the right of the screen, left, or the bottom. So we're going to have to check the player's position or the player's rect to reference that. So let's write like a nice if-else statement here. So we'll say if keys, and inside of here, we're going to look if keys hold pygame.k_up. So that means if that list keys has the key up, it means it was being pressed. So we want to move up, but we're also going to check and is the player's rect dot top. So is the top of the player greater than 0? So remember, the top of the screen on the y-coordinate is 0. So if it's greater than 0, if it's like, I don't know, 30, it means it's down here. There's room for it to move up. But if the top of the player is right at 0, or if it's less than 0, well, then it shouldn't be able to move up anymore. It'll move up off the screen. So as long as those two conditions are true, we'll just pass for right now. We'll fill it in later. Let's do similar situations for the other key presses. So we'll say elif keys, and here we'll do pygame.k down. And player rect.bottom. This time we want to make sure the bottom of the player, remember, as we go down, it gets greater and greater and greater and greater. It has to be less than the window width. All right, so we'll say less than window height. Window width would have been the wrong direction. All right, so it'll go all the way down until, what did we set our window to be, 600? Yeah, we set it to be 600. All right, perfect. So that takes care of the vertical direction. Let's do the horizontal direction. elif keys. We'll do pygame.k_left. Ooh, better make sure that's capital. All right, left. And player rect.left is greater than 0. All right, so 0 is over here. If it's moving to the left, we got to make sure it's not past the side of the screen yet. We'll pass, and then we'll do elif keys pygame.k_right is being held down, and player_rect.right is less than the window width. And that's kind of, similar thing. If it's moving to the right, it's going to increase. We want to make sure it's not going to go past this window. Now, we'll also have an else statement. And what will be the else block? Well, the else block will be, what if the user is not pressing any keys? Well, if the user is not pressing any keys, then we want them to not move at all. And so if we want them to not move, then we'll essentially set our self.dx variable to 0 and our self.dy variable to 0. That will stop our movement. What do we want to do if the user moves up? Well, if they are trying to go up, we don't want them to move in the x direction, so we'll say self.dx is equal to 0. But then what do we want to change our dy variable to be? We'll set it to self.dy. It was 0, but now we want to move them. To move up means we need to decrease our y value. So I'm going to set this to -1. And then I'm going to specify kind of like the intervals with which I want the player to be able to move. And the interval I want them to be able to move is the size of the rectangle. So our size attribute right here. So that would mean, like, if the rectangle is this big, when it moves up, it would move up and it would be right on top of it the next time. There would be like no overlapping, essentially. So I'll do -1 times self.size. All right, let's do a similar thing if we want to move down. Well, if we want to move down, we're not moving in the x direction. And in our y direction, it's going to be +1 times self.size. Of course, you could just write self.size, but I think it helps us see it a little bit better. What about if we move to the left? Well, if we move to the left, then self.dx is going to be a value. To the left, we're going to be -1 times self.size. And our self.dy, we don't want to move. And if we move to the right, it'll be self.dx is equal to +1 times self.size. And our vertical direction movement will be, oops, what just happened there? Our vertical direction movement will be self.dy is going to be equal to 0. Okay, great. So now that we have these sort of changes in our x and y positions, we really need to update the value of our x and y positions. So we'll say update the player's current coordinates. So we'll use self.x. We'll update the x attribute of the player by adding to it whatever self.dx is. So if we were moving to the right, we'd add a positive value of whatever our size is, 25, I think. If we were moving to the left, we would add a negative 25, so it would move it to the left. And we'll do something similar with self.y plus equals self.dy. And it would be a similar analysis in the vertical direction. With these things changed, we should now update the player's coordinate attribute. So we'll update the player's coordinate attribute by saying, hey, self.coord is now going to equal a tuple, whatever the current x value is, whatever the current y value is. We've kept the size, so self.size is still the same, and we'll keep self.size here. So we'll move them. We'll update the top left corner essentially, and it'll move the rectangle for us. Okay, so I think that's it for this tutorial on kind of the basics of Pygame. If we run this now, let's see if this all works. All right, so I've got my timer moving. There's my rectangle. I should be able to move him with some key presses. Awesome. He is bound to the game window, so that's working out wonderfully. So this is kind of going to be a rough blueprint of the game that we are going to work to create. Imagine having multiple little rectangles flying all over the screen, and as they move across the black background, we are painting that black background with whatever color that rectangle is. Now you can see our time goes negative. That's a feature we'll most certainly have to add to the game, that we're going to end the game when the time gets to 0. But for right now, I think this is a great introduction to some of the ways we will use Pygame when we work to create our own multiplayer game. And this is exactly what we will start in our next video. So I'll see you then.